Gerald Robeson just changed the lyrics to a Johnny Cash song for me, so I've achieved everything I'd like in ministry, and I can retire happy now. For the last couple years, I have been leading youth ministry trainings for our southern region of the Unitarian Universalist Association. There's an activity I do sometimes with the youth advisors I'm training where I ask them to write different identities that they have on the backs of index cards and then arrange the cards into piles based on whether those are privileged identities or oppressed identities. The last time I did this, someone who shares a lot of my identities. He was a young, white, temporarily able-bodied, middle-class, hetero-cis male. He finished the exercise and he said to me, deadpan, "All my cards are in the privilege pile." And then he hesitated for a minute and he said, "I think I know what privileged means, but I'm not sure." And someone in our group with several marginalized identities spoke up and they said, "Privilege is not having to think about your identity." I was so proud of these young Unitarian Universalist leaders because they were willing to risk embarrassment and difficult conversations for the sake of educating our training group. I appreciated that definition. A privileged identity is one you don't have to think about. So I want to acknowledge from the top here that talking about privilege is hard because by definition, our own privilege is something that most of us have never had to think about. We are all privileged in some way, and we've all had a hard time seeing how we are privileged. As Unitarian Universalists who are yearning to grow in our capacities for both compassion and justice making, we are called to make efforts to learn about our privilege, become more aware of our identities, and how those inform our efforts to make the world a more just and equitable place. I want to model this process of awareness this morning by telling you about how I became more cognizant of my privilege. And I also want to encourage each of us to reflect on how we might use our privilege in building the beloved community. These are inherently difficult and awkward conversations, but we are not afraid of making mistakes and learning from them. Here at UUCA, we don't shy away from difficult conversations. No single event has done more to help me be aware of my privilege than spending a day being incarcerated. So maybe you never expected to hear this from your minister, but getting arrested is great. There's definitely a lot of downsides, including discomfort, time lost, experiencing the dehumanizing effects of our criminal justice system. I'll talk more specifically about those. But all in all, I cannot recommend the experience highly enough. Our worship series for this summer is entitled Treasures of Our Lives, and I want to show you one of the treasures I got last month. Professional headshots, $250. Off-center mugshot, priceless. So the Georgia Board of Regents, the folks who determine higher education policy in our state, have a number of exclusionary policies that prevent undocumented students from attending the 3 best public universities in Georgia, that force undocumented students to pay out-of-state tuition at other state schools. And the Georgia legislature is currently contemplating a bill that would prevent private universities from being sanctuary campuses for undocumented students. On May 16th, I got arrested with 7 other allies for interrupting a Board of Regents meeting to protest these segregationist policies. The Board of Regents was a career highlight for me, and I want to profoundly thank this congregation for supporting me in the work of prophetic witness. This proof of incarceration is the treasure of my life that I want to talk about today. The greatest gifts of this action came in the form of new or newly deepened relationships that came out of it. The students and teachers at Freedom University, who we will hear from in a little bit later in this service. Freedom University is a freedom school for undocumented students in Georgia that organized the protest. And these students and teachers are some of the most likable folks I have ever met. If and when there are opportunities to collaborate with them in the future at UUCA, I encourage each and every one of you to take advantage of those opportunities. My other favorite thing about getting arrested as a minister is all the great stories you get from folks who have showed up for racial justice and all kinds of social justice in the past in our congregation. Of the many folks here at UUCA who have showed up for what is right, I want to give shout outs to Pat Harris and Charles Forrest for participating in previous Regents protests, Sarah Patterson for speaking on the floor of the Indiana State Legislature in favor of LGBTQ rights, and Una Powell for standing on the side of love with marginalized folks in her community and in her workplace. Folks, this is a congregation of folks who walk the walk, who confront our fears about speaking truth to power head on and face to face. And we want UUCA to be a place where you get support and affirmation in speaking one's truth. I was proud to hear so many stories of folks here who've leveraged your privilege in the past, and I am optimistic, particularly with us having a social justice coordinator coming on staff, about our future ability to be transformative as a transformative institution in Atlanta and in Georgia. I'm so glad to know in particular that I am not the first person from UUCA to protest the Board of Regents, because providing equal access to higher education here in Georgia for undocumented students is going to be a long and uphill battle. One of the first things I noticed going into their meeting was that I had the privilege of looking like I belonged. As the protests have gone on at the Board of Regents, the state troopers who provide security for those meetings have begun to racially profile the attendees and to keep an eye out for demonstrators, folks who are younger and appear to be of Hispanic descent. As a white guy in a suit, I was able to walk in with nobody giving me a second look. I was kind of curious about the differences between being arrested in Rhode Island and Massachusetts versus being arrested in Georgia. And one of the things, it may have just been the specific circumstances of this action, but I've never been arrested without warning before. I started talking, and before I knew it, the state trooper was pulling me out by the arm. Having been said, there was no harmful police violence as part of us getting arrested. And I think this is a form of privilege, no doubt aided by our status as professionally dressed meeting attendees and the fortuitous appearance of a legal observer. We then spent about 9 hours in police custody. The first hour, my colleague, the Reverend Jeff Jones, and I were zip-tied in the back of a police car. We had no air conditioning, and we were waiting for Fulton County Jail to do a fire drill. Although the jail itself did end up being cold, in retrospect, I do regret wearing my thermal underwear on that day. We waited in the car for about an hour, and when we got to the jail, we waited a lot more at every step of the way. The police force you to wait at each stage of the process, force you to remember that things are being done on their timeline, not yours. Waiting is just one of the many ways our criminal justice system is designed to psychologically wear down its prisoners. When we finally got inside the jail, the first thing the police did was to strip search us. They told me to squat and cough. We waited some more, and then they processed us medically. The police gave some in our group TB and pregnancy tests. We waited, and then there would be a burst of instructions, some of them conflicting with each other, so that our status as violators and criminals was deepened by the impossibility of correctly following their instructions. I was very grateful, at least, that I had my hearing aids in and was able to understand their instructions some of the time. I asked to use the restroom and was directed to a holding cell where there was nothing but a sheet of plexiglass between me and the main waiting area in the jail. The policeman who strip searched me took my migraine medication and told me it would be returned as they processed us. I did not get my medication back. The Atlanta Police Department made me feel like less of a person with basic human rights. They dehumanized me the way that all parts of our criminal justice system dehumanize everyone who we imprison. While incarcerated, I also became more acutely aware of the many ways that I have privilege. When I was going to the bathroom in view of other inmates and prison personnel, I was aware of my privilege as a cisgender male. When they took my medication and did not return it, I was aware that even though I have a chronic illness, there are some days when migraines don't affect me, and I'm able to afford medication for the days when they do. My privilege as someone who is white, professional, and ordained was clear in the difference between how we were treated as a group and how other inmates, average inmates, were treated on the day that we were there. 9 hours is relatively a very short time to be in police custody. My comrades and I had the privilege of the American Friends Service Committee calling Fulton County on our behalf. I have no doubt that had an effect on us getting out of there sooner. We really noticed the pressure that they applied and the speed with which we were processed after that call got made. So to preach about privilege as part of a series called Treasures of Our Lives, I was worried that it would sound like privilege was a treasure of my life. In fact, it was giving up at least some of my privilege that was the treasure. As a person with privileged identities, I can think of nothing better to do with them than to sacrifice them for the sake of a more just world. The times when I have risked or sacrificed some of my privilege are the times I am most proud of in my life. It is my sincerest hope for all of you that you will have opportunities to risk whatever privilege you have, and that you will take those opportunities if the cost is one that you can afford. To be embarrassingly honest, I struggled with how to describe this experience. As Gerald mentioned, I spent less time in jail even than Johnny Cash. But being able to avoid hard conversations is a form of privilege, one that I want to give up and that I want to ask those of us at UUCA who have that privilege to give up. The hard conversation is that on the one hand, incarceration has been one of the most profoundly eye-opening experiences I've ever had in terms of cultivating a sense of empathy for folks with marginalized identities in our society. On the other hand, I experienced it in the most mild possible version of incarceration, no matter how you measure it, and so I am hesitant to proclaim any degree of understanding of what oppressed people endure every day. But leveraging privilege is an important message, and I want to risk conveying it imperfectly. Because if we let fear of making mistakes stop us from having difficult conversations, we will never grow as a community and as a movement. I said before that we are a congregation that walks the walk, and sometimes that means talking the talk, because there are a lot of very difficult and awkward conversations that we need to have before we can truly move forward in solidarity as a community and as a movement. Leveraging privilege is an important message and an important part of growing that solidarity, and I'm not going to let my fear of embarrassment get in the way. I'm not going to let criticism and infighting get in the way. If there's a difficult conversation to be had about how to bring our justice making out into the world, I say, bring it on. And if you're not afraid to have difficult conversations about anti-oppression work, let me hear you say, bring it on. If you're not afraid to have difficult conversations about racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, and transphobia, let me hear you say, bring it on. And if you're not afraid to have difficult conversations that ask you to sacrifice your personal comfort for the sake of building a more just and equitable world, let me hear you say, bring it on. Bring it on. Peace, salam, shalom, and may